Okay, in this video, we're continuing our discussion of AUC Section 315, Understanding the Entity and Assessing the Risk of Material Misstatement. So far, we've been going through the components of internal control. And so this is the last one, monitoring of controls. So basically, all of the components of internal control that we talked about before in the prior videos, this particular component tells us that we need to monitor or gain an understanding of how the entity monitors the all of the other controls that they have in place to make sure that the controls are operating appropriately and that they're appropriately designed and implemented. So it says here that we should obtain an understanding of the major activities that the entity uses to monitor internal control over financial reporting, including those related to those control activities relevant to the audit and how the entity initiates remedial actions to deficiencies in its control. So as before, in the other control components of internal control, we were required to gain an understanding of the processes and the controls that they have in place, as well as the tone at the top, etc. So here we need to understand how they determine whether those controls are operating effectively, and if they're not, what remedial actions do they perform to correct them or make them better. It says also that if the entity has an internal audit function, then we should obtain an understanding of the nature of the internal audit function's responsibilities and how the internal audit function fits into the entity's organizational structure and activities performed or to be performed. And finally, we should obtain an understanding of the sources of the information used in the entity's monitoring activities and the basis upon which the management considers the information to be sufficiently reliable for the purpose. So what is it that they do to monitor, and what do they look at to see if the controls are operating effectively? So anyway, we've got a lot of supporting sections here, A114 through A125. So let's go down to those explanatory material sections and see what additional information there is to help us perform this step. Okay, now we're in the explanatory material, talking about monitoring or gaining an understanding of the monitoring of the controls. So monitoring of controls is a process to assess the effectiveness of internal control, the performance over time. So management would perform this through ongoing activities or separate evaluations or combinations of the two, and it's an ongoing process, management and supervisory activity. So as we spoke before, if the entity has an internal audit function, then we need to understand how that internal audit function fits into the monitoring procedures and to the structure of the company. And so through the internal audit function and gaining an understanding of it, we certainly gain an understanding of how the entity monitors its controls, because that's somewhat part of the internal audit function. And so from that, we would find out relevant information to assess the risk of material misstatement. And so there's an entirely different section in the clarified audit standards, AUC section 610, using the work of internal auditors. So if we decide to rely on some of the internal audit functions, their work to reduce our audit procedures, then we would have to follow the procedures in this. But this is a totally different section and purpose. Here, we just need to understand how the internal audit functions and how it fits into their monitoring process. At this point, we're not necessarily trying to rely on the work that they've done. We merely wanting to understand how they operate. And some parts of gaining that understanding might be understanding the nature of the responsibilities of the internal audit, their status within the organization, their authority and accountability, and the size of the structure of the entity, and how they are viewed or report to management or those charged with governance. So certainly, if the internal audit has more authority or accountability or more complex structure or higher status within the organization, then they would do a more robust job of monitoring the controls than one who is less complex or has less authority, so on and so forth. And so some of the things that internal audit might do might be performing procedures and evaluating the results, so that they can provide assurance to management and those charged with governance regarding the design and effectiveness of risk management, internal control, and governance processes. So they're auditors, but within the organization, to help management understand and be assured that the processes and controls are operating effectively within the organization. However, internal control might also, their responsibilities might be focused on evaluating the economy, efficiency, and effectiveness of the operations, and maybe not so much as the financial reporting. And in that case, they wouldn't have as large of a role in the monitoring of controls. And so to gain an understanding of all these things and how involved internal audit is within the financial reporting process, we can inquire of appropriate individuals within the internal audit function. That was in accordance with the paragraph that we had a video in prior at AUC section 6A. But that would help us gain an understanding of the nature of the internal audit function's responsibilities. And so if it turns out that internal audit is responsible for a lot of the entity's financial reporting, then we may obtain further understanding of those activities they perform. And we might also ask them and request and look at the internal audit function's audit plan for the period, if they have one, and discussing that with appropriate individuals within the function. So that would certainly help us understand their role within the monitoring of the controls if we have and can review their plan. So as we briefly talked about before, if it turns out that the internal audit has a lot of responsibility and assurance activities related to the entity's financial reporting, then we might could rely on some of the work that they've done to reduce the nature, the timing, or extent of some of our audit procedures. But as we discussed before, that's a totally different AUC Section 610, totally different process. But at this point in planning our audit, we could gain a little more understanding of what we could do there so that we can later on design audit procedures and determine what of internal audit functions procedures we can rely on to hopefully reduce some of our own procedures. It's more likely that we can use the internal audits function when it appears, based on experience in previous audits or our risk assessment procedures, that the entity has an internal audit function that's adequately and appropriately resourced relative to the size of the entity and the nature of its operations, and has direct reporting relationship to those charged with governance. So if the internal audit seems to have enough people, they seem to be smart, it seems like they do a good job, and they have good reporting, then it might be good for us to rely on their work. But if all those things are the opposite, then maybe we can't really rely on their work too much. But that certainly is an AUC Section 610, totally outside the purview of what this section here is about. This is just giving a little color on how that works and kind of referring us to 610 if we're going to try to rely on internal controls work. But here we're just wanting to gain an understanding of how internal audit functions within the organization. And in this part, they suggest if we are going to communicate with internal audit that we initiate that communication early in the engagement, and that facilitates an effective sharing of information, creates an environment where we can be informed of significant matters and inform them of significant matters. It might also help internal audit to bring significant matters to our attention that we can use in our risk assessment. And finally, they tell us a little bit about sources of information for us to use whenever we're gaining an understanding of the monitoring of controls process at the entity. And they say that much of the information used in the monitoring can be produced by the entity's information system. So if management assumes that data used for monitoring are accurate without having a basis for that assumption, errors that may exist in the information could potentially lead management to incorrect conclusions from its monitoring activities. Therefore, if we gain an understanding of the information that they are using to monitor their controls, then we can determine whether that information is a good source of information to use. And so an understanding of the following is required as part of the auditor's understanding of the entity's monitoring activities component of internal control. And that would be the sources of information related to the entity's monitoring activities and the basis upon which management considers the information to be sufficiently reliable for the purpose. So in our work papers for this particular section, we might want to make sure we include these two things as items that we gained an understanding of when we were determining or gaining an understanding of the monitoring of how the client monitors its control.